Welcome you all to this session on an apology for poetry by Sir Philip Sidney. I am Shanavas Assistant Professor in the PG Department of English, Amal College of Advanced Studies, Nilambur, Kerala. Sir Philip Sidney, as you might have already heard about him, you might have read about him, he's one of the most prominent writers in the Elizabethan age. He was an English poet, he was a courtier, he was a scholar, he was a soldier, and he was born at Penshurst, Kent, for an aristocratic family. He was educated at Shrewsbury and Christ University, Oxford, and he was the elder son of Sir Henry Sidney and Lady Mary Dudley. And in 1572, at the age of 18, he was elected to the Parliament as a member of Parliament for Shrewsbury. And these are some of his major works: Astrophel and Sella, which came out in 1591, Arcadia 1598, The Defense of Poesy, or Defense of Poetry, or as we now know as An Apology for Poetry. Then Edwin Spencer, had dedicated his Shepherd's Calendar to Philip Sidney. Directly come to the major work that we are going to discuss here today, that is An Apology for Poetry. And the word apology can stand for defense, justification, or whatever, because poetry at that period of time faced severe criticism by many so-called poet haters. So Sidney actually wanted to give a befitting reply to the charges leveled against poetry. Poetry may stand for literature in general. So especially it was immediately provoked by Stephen Gossen's work, The School of Abuse, which was ironically dedicated to Sir Philip Sidney. In fact, Philip Sidney did not subscribe to the views expressed in the work School of Abuse. He was a puritanical dramatist, so that he opposed the English stage and his, lack of morality and all those things. So, and it was dedicated to Sidney also. It was actually a kind of scathing remark against literature in general. So Sidney could not go with it. So he thought of, saving poetry from being debased, and of course to save poetry and get back the lost image of poetry. So he thought he would write an apology for poetry. And that was the immediate reason that prompted Philip Sidney to write this piece of work. And so this is what Sidney actually says. He wanted to defend his unelected vocation. So Sidney himself does not claim that he is a poet, but he happens to become a poet. That's why it's an unelected vocation. And he wanted to defend his unelected vocation, that is poetry, because poetry has fallen from its privileged position among the arts to be the laughing stock of children. And Sidney has said in different parts of his essay, that is An Apology for Poetry, that poetry is the monarch of all arts. It's a king of all arts. But now, because of the unfettered criticism that is unleashed against poetry and literature in general, Sidney feels that it has lost its privileged position in the society. Poetry was often held above all other disciplines, be it moral philosophy or history or science, astronomy. It was placed above all these things. But now, thanks to the criticism of different people, it has lost its privileged position, and it has become simply a laughing stock of children. So he wanted to save literature or poetry. Whenever I say poetry here, it means literature in general. Okay, so from being debased like that. So he feels that critics are really ungrateful, because all these critics are actually the product of poetry itself. Or we can say every society, every civilization was in fact evolved through literature. the kind of literature or the poetry that used to supply them the models for their culture and society. So these critics are also in a way the product of the culture that they are the part of now. But they are so much ungrateful that they keep criticizing poetry. So because he says poetry is a means through which the young are educated, and it is the first nurse who introduces children into learning. Okay, so that's why you cannot just get away without poetry. That is inextricably, inseparably connected to our personal life, our culture, our civilization. That is what he wanted to highlight, the important point. And he quotes number of examples in his speech. It is why I mentioned speech. This is an essay, but it is written in the form of an oration, having 7 parts in it. So that's why I have mentioned it as a speech. So in this, essay that is an apology for poetry, he tries to quotes a lot of examples from Bible, from mythology, and from other, lives of the people, that how poetry was so much instrumental in leading people into a virtuous life. So for example, he says archaic poets like Livius and Evans in Latin tradition, they inspired people to become civilized. And Chaucer, of course, encouraged and delighted later poets to beautify our mother tongue. By way, he was just mentioning Chaucer also, how Chaucer was enriching the language, etc. And Sidney notes that the word charm in English, even the word charm actually comes from the Latin word carmen, which means a poem. So that means, poem is equated with charm. Whatever that is charming can be poetic. So it actually shows the inherent relationship between poetry and charm. What adds charm to our life? What makes things charming is actually the poem in it. So even the etymology of the word charm actually tells us that. And the song and the prophecies of the oracle at Delphi and Sibyl, they were all delivered in verse. In Greek mythology, we have the oracles of Delphi, the oracles of Sibyl, and Sibyl, it has reappeared in, Wasteland also, you know that. Yes. And so all these oracles were delivered in verse. So that shows the power of the verse to move people. So that is what he wanted to say here. And he also cites examples of how poetry was rather really influential even in Christianity. Why he give emphasis on what you can say Christianity, because Stephen Colson strongly attacked poetry in the name of Christianity because it is irreligious in one way, because it takes people away from religious beliefs, etc. So he wanted to find out that Christianity was very much rooted in poetry, or they all promoted that. For example, Prophet David wrote psalms or the divine poems. Dawood in Arabic, in Arabic it is said Dawood. In biblical tradition it is David. So he wrote psalms, divine poems. They were all in the form of poetry. And he says poetry deserves not to be scorched out of the church of the God. What happened after the Puritans came to power was that they opposed everything. That the theaters were closed and all those things happened. So they viewed everything that was part of literature very critically. Even the poem by Robert Browning, Fra Lippo, actually speaks about that, how church actually began to be very dubious about the power of art and or the noble power of art in a way. And so here, Philip Sidney actually wanted to emphasize the fact that poetry deserves to be in the religion, because it is not to be scorched out of the Church of God. And maybe you may remember the lines from Fra Lippo by Browning, where he says that art gives a better purpose of conveying the ideas of God to the people than the pulpit space. That means art is better than the preaching of a priest to make people understand the value of God's creation. So probably the same idea somewhere else is explaining here, Philip Sidney. So in Greek language, and also he keeps on highlighting the importance of a poet. Earlier he said that the word charm in English has its root in the word poet. And he says in Greek language, the word for poet is poetos, which means maker. So a poet is just like a god. God is a creator. God is a maker. So here also, a poet is also a maker. He's not just a person who simply mirrors the world around him, but he makes it. A poet creates a perfect golden world. So the very etymology of the word poets in Greek language also shows the level of importance that was attributed to poets in those times, in the time of Greek civilization, where poetry was held highly superior to all other disciplines. And even if you look at Latin tradition, I have already mentioned about that. The word waits, which meant seer or a prophet. Poets had the rare power of predicting the future. Poets could foresee the world. Poets could foresee the world that was to come. So that is why he gave, even Latin tradition, people gave importance to poets. They were revered as great people who would predict future. And Philip Sidney also says that poetry is the language of all learning. The earliest Greek scientists, he cites examples, all types of learning, all disciplines had resorted to poetry to convey their message or to formulate their concepts and, of course, to explain their ideas. We can say, for example, he cites the example of earliest Greek scientists, Thales, Epiphilus, and Parmenides. They all sang their philosophy in verses. Okay. Whenever I gave quotations, it means I'm taking the exact word that was used by Sidney there. So they all sang their philosophy in verses. So philosophy, verses or poetry was inevitable and indispensable for all kind of people who were practicing different disciplines. And this was the same case with moral philosophy also. Even the moral philosophers, they expounded their theories, complicated concepts in the form of verse. So that actually shows the poetry has the power to convey things in a better way. And Herodotus, we know, is the father of history. He stole or usurped from the poetry the description of human emotion. And see, Herodotus, actually he used poetry to describe the human emotions. In a way, Herodotus, the historian, of course, in the coming part of this, apology for poetry, Sidney actually explains, the advantages that the poets have over historians. And he actually compares historian, philosopher, and the poets. So that's why he mentions here Herodotus, the father of history. And even historians, for example, Herodotus, one of the greatest historians in the past, had resorted to, poetry to describe human emotions. And according to Sidney, these writers could never become popular had they written poetically. So whether they were, for example, we will come to that distinction because philosophy is something very abstract, and it's a very dry concept when it is articulated in a very dry, prosaic language. So when it is conveyed poetically, people will try to get into the ideas. People could understand the ideas that is expressed articulated by a philosopher. So philosophers always used poetic language to formulate their ideas, or historians also, because hadn't they resorted to this poetry, they could never have become popular, because in order to become popular, they would have needed a language which was really appealing to the people. So it was because they all had resorted to poetry to articulate their ideas that they could become popular. That's what he wants to say. And poets create perfect people with perfect virtues. So perfection, poets, even this was the idea that even Aristotle actually discusses. One of the charges made by Plato against literature was that literature is, or poetry is, or art is twice removed from reality. It does not represent the reality. And in fact, Aristotle had given a reply also at that time that poets need not, what you can say, represent the reality as such, because what they were trying to represent was the ideal reality, or what we can say the reality which was yet to come. And similarly here also the same idea is replicated in for Philip Sidney's argument also. Poets, they do not create ordinary people, they just don't represent the ordinary things. Okay, that is what a historian might do perhaps, but that is not the job of a poet. He creates he creates perfect people with perfect virtues, an ideal vision of the people, an ideal vision of the virtues, an ideal vision of image of the world. That is what the poets actually do. And poets resemble God. And as we already said, going back to the Latin root, faith, which meant, maker. Poet is actually a maker. He resembles God. He is not just a part of nature, he is actually a maker of nature, because poet is able to perfect God's nature through poetry. He also tries to present God's nature in a better way, not just representing it. And so Sidney defines poetry to be an act of imitation, and Sidney also defines, and we know the theory of mimesis postulated by Aristotle, where he said art is an imitation, right? And here he also believes that art or poetry is an act of imitation, but not just it's not just an ordinary imitation, but it is actually an imitation of a higher order of, what you can say, the perfect things. Okay, now Sidney actually comes to three major categories of poetry. Sidney identifies three major categories of poetry, and the chief of both in antiquity and excellence is the poetry that imitates the inconceivable excellencies of God. And Sidney identifies certain pieces of poetry which are really great, and he identifies three major categories, and the most important one, because of antiquity, because it has been there as a tradition for a longer period, and also because of the excellency it had. He identifies the poetry that imitates the inconceivable. Inconceivable means something that we cannot understand. Such highly what is a complicated excellencies of God. For example, David's poetry in Psalm, as I mentioned in the beginning, yeah, that was written in that tradition actually. The things which are imitating, not the ordinary things, but some higher order things. The Psalms by Prophet David, Solomon's Song of Songs, also the prayers which are about God and other things, not ordinary mundane things, and even the poems of Homer. Homer did not become the part of, or he was not the part of, what you can say, the Christian tradition, but he was the of pagan tradition. But even the poems that he wrote was actually part of this, the first type of poetry that Philip Sidney has identified. And second type of poems that he speaks about, or he is categorizing, is philosophical poems. Tritus, who wrote about war, Cato, or Virgil's Georgius about natural philosophy. So these are some of the examples for philosophical poems, and they constitute the second part of, what to say, poetry, the second category of poetry that Sidney identifies. And thirdly, poetry written by right poets, right poems by right poets. Uh, he explains that. We'll just go through. If philosophical painters are like painters who paint the people in front of them, The right poets are like those who use their imagination to paint in color the fittest for the eye to see. This is how he explains. And there is a difference between the philosophical painters and the right poets. Philosophical painters are just what you can say realist painters, we can say. They just record what they see in front of them. But the right poets, they paint things in front of them, not as they see it, but in the best possible way, in the most beautiful way. For hence, a good painter does not paint the Roman heroine Lucretia. For example, there is a philosophical poet, and there is a philosophical painter, and the right painter, we can say, right quote unquote. So he explains the difference. For example, there is the Roman heroine Lucretia, whom the painter never saw. So according to Sidney, the philosophical painter, or the ordinary painter, simply represents the external beauty, the outward beauty of Lucretia as uh, as a beauty as such, whereas the real painter, or the right painter, quote unquote right painter, paints the outward beauty of Lucretia as a sign of the inward virtues that she represents. So these right poets, like the best painter, create in order to teach and delight. Sidney believes that poetry should teach people virtues. Poetry should teach virtues to the people, and of course it should give people delight as well. So the purpose of poetry is actually to teach and delight. So the best painter does it in a perfect way. They are not limited by what is or what has been in the world, as historian or philosopher might be, but rather enter into the divine considerations of what might be and what should be. Say, a historian is concerned with what has been in the world, what was happening in the world, what happened in the world. Whereas a philosopher is concerned with what is the state. A philosopher actually tries to explain things with the help of ideas and concepts. The mysteries of the world are explained by a philosopher using his tools, his ideas, and his logic. So he is concerned with is, what the world is. Whereas a poet actually is concerned with what might be the world, or what should be the nature of this world, how people should behave, how people should conduct themselves, etc. So that's why it was so much poet is so much concerned with the divine considerations of what might be, not what has been or what is, and he is concerned with what might be happening if we had done it, or what should be done, or what we have to do. So these rights poets deserve the title of waiters and teach their readers to be virtuous. So, of course, they do deserve the title of a waiters, maker, because they make a new world. They present to us a new vision of the world that in which we should live, that should give us comfort, peace, happiness. So, poets try to give us a world which represent a real vision of the world, and that should teach their readers to be virtuous. So poetry should move people to be virtuous. So that is what he reiterates here also. And and he, as I mentioned in the beginning, he has already opined that poetry is the monarch of all arts, because poetry as a tool for teaching virtue, and poets as a semi-divine figure capable of imagining more perfect version of nature. And we have already mentioned that, because even taking the Latin tradition, wait as the word, which was equal to poet, had the primary meaning of a maker, which was the general attribute of God, and which is still the general attribute of God. Okay, and and the structure also, as I mentioned, it had 7 parts in it, and it was written in the form of an oration. And unlike our modern conception of poetry as belonging to the realm of literature, Sidney thinks of poetry as a branch of learning, like any other science, to attempt the betterment of the people. So the purpose of any other disciplines, according to Sidney, was to make people, human beings, better or to make their lives better. And poetry also had the similar purpose, according to Sidney. Poetry, should try to move people into virtuous, civilized, human beings. And poetry as the end of teaching virtue. And this is the purpose. Poetry should teach and delight. Poetry should teach virtues. The best possible end of poetry is that one. Therefore, according to Sidney's logic, it is the best of arts. It is the best of all other arts. Be it painting or music, poetry is more superior. And among the primary challenges for the title of Prince of Arts is moral philosophy. And he discusses various disciplines which actually are the counterparts of poetry. And he wanted to highlight, how poetry can be treated as something very superior to all these disciplines. And moral philosophy is one among them. So he says, Sidney imagines that moral philosophers confronting him with a sullen gravity, speak to him sophistically against subtlety, and in a general full of moral paradoxes. And this will be really confusing. See, an ordinary person, say a layman, when he listens to the philosophical exposition by a philosopher, how he expounds his philosophy, he'll be really confused because philosophy speaks with a kind of sullen gravity, extreme seriousness, which makes us really dull. We will not be, if things are so much serious, we will not be in a mood to listen to it every now and then. At least ordinary people cannot accept that. It may not be appealing to the ordinary people.
See, even things which are inherently repulsive, uh, something which is morbid, something which is macabre, we will even take it, we will even listen to it when it is presented artistically, right? That is what Aristotle has said, something that he was referring to as catharsis, the tragic pleasure that the viewers might get from watching a tragedy. So it is possible in the case of an art. Usually we don't want to we don't want to hear about the sufferings or about monsters and all. They'll be really scary and really repulsive. But when it is presented with the help of poetry in literature, that is presented in rather an interesting way, that the viewers attain or get some kind of pleasure out of it. So therefore, poetry is a kind of medicine of cherries, giving pleasure while also delivering the medicine of virtue. When we are taking the medicine, when we are giving medicine to children, we give them medicine at the same time it is coated with some sugar, substance, so that they would enjoy the taste of the sweetness of that particular medicine. At the same time, medicine works in their body and cure their diseases. Right. So same thing happens here also. Poetry interests the readers. Poetry interests the viewers. At the same time, by providing delight, poetry also teaches some virtues. See, in this part of this one, lecture, uh, Philip Sidney actually speaks about a historian. Earlier, he was referring to the philosopher. How philosopher would be conveying his ideas in a dry, prosaic language, which is full of complexity and which the ordinary reader or a layman could not actually enjoy. Similar thing, what about, and he was also referring to, he was actually juxtaposing the philosopher against poets. Poets present the same ideas probably in a more interesting way, okay, with the help of some stories and other things as we found in the just now. See, and now we come to a historian. Historian, on the other hand, laden with old mouse-eaten records, is similarly beyond bound by the discourse of history. A historian also has his own way of presenting things. He knows more about the past than the present. He is more concerned about what really happened, and he claims to know more about the virtue than the philosopher, because while philosopher teaches by certain abstract considerations, the historian teaches active virtues as embodied in the historical events, such as the Battle of Marathon, uh, etc. So
Yeah.
historian, what he does is, he rather speaks more directly to the reader than the philosopher did, because he cites examples from history and shows this is how it happened, this is what happened, etc. in a matter of fact way. So unlike philosopher, he would be presenting more examples to the people so that they can see through things and they can understand things. So historian complements the philosopher in that history, because history provides a wealth of concrete examples with which to illustrate abstract ideas of philosophy. So philosopher presents abstract ideas and thoughts, whereas a historian presents what you can say concrete examples. Probably these concrete examples are the manifestations of the ideas that philosopher may have conveyed. So historian is in a way they are complementary. Historian completes the philosopher. Philosopher has left. Historian begins where the philosopher has left. The abstract ideas he is converting into the concrete ideas. Rather because he cites examples from world history, the lives of the people, the incidents that occurred in a particular kingdom, and he shows certain concrete examples. And Sidney compares the poet with the historian and philosopher now. And Sidney actually compares that. Again, he says historian, of course, presents, what you can say, examples. But the problem is that again, his presentation, uh, does not hold good, because he's only concerned with the past. See, he observes that neither philosophy nor history can teach virtue on its own. One gives the moral principle, the other historical example. On means the philosopher gives the moral principles. He sometimes lectures on moral principles. The historian, on the other hand, provides examples. But one or the other cannot teach virtue independently. So virtues as such cannot be independent. What the philosopher does, what the historian does is, on the basis of the philosophy, he gives them examples. Okay, and philosopher cannot stand alone, because philosopher does not provide any examples. He only gives the ideas. And according to Philip Sidney, neither of them can actually teach virtues independently. Uh, so the moral principle is too abstract. The historical examples not abstract enough. So both have got its own disadvantages, we can say. They are incomplete in its own way. So where is the poetry then? So in poetry, whereas can combine both. A poet can give abstract principles like a philosopher and compelling examples like a historian with his speaking picture. And he speaks about poetry as speaking picture, because poetry gives us some speaking images through which he can convey the abstract principles conveyed by a moral philosopher, and also the concrete examples that are given by a historian. So, using this argument, we can say that what Sidney claims is that a poet is far superior to a historian and a philosopher, because a poet combines the skill of a philosopher, or his quality of generating abstract thoughts and ideas, and the power of a historian of generating examples. So a poet does both in a way. He combines both. He can give us abstract principles like a philosopher, and at the same time, he can provide striking examples from history, just like a historian, because his work is actually a speaking picture. And Sidney also associates poetry with the bright light of enlightenment, since poetry can illuminate what may otherwise lie dark to the mind of the reader. So, a poet can actually enlighten the mind of the readers, because what was remaining a dark recesses in the mind of the reader can be enlightened by a poet with his insight, with his intuition, and with his power of imagination. That is what Sidney says. And then, to show the power of poetry to teach virtue, Sidney cites classical Roman example and an Old Testament religious example, drawing upon the two most authoritative sources available to him as a Renaissance author. And we know that these were the two traditions. One is the pagan tradition, probably exemplified by the Roman civilization or Greek civilization and the Judeo-Christian tradition, which the modern England, Europe witnessed after the arrival of Christianity and all. So he cites examples from both actually the pagan tradition, the Hellenic culture, the Roman civilization, and also from the Old Testament to show that how poetry was capable of teaching virtue, inculcating virtuous behavior among the people. And he says, if the arts and learning they yield are meant to improve readers in some way, then poetry must be the best of the arts and the poet the best of the artist. Because if you judge art on the basis of his power to teach people, in some way, he would say that poetry is the best form of art, because no other branches of art could do the same task with greater dexterity and power as to the poets. So that's why he gives importance to poets. He places poets on a loftier pedestal because they are far superior to other artists as well, and the poets are the best of the artists. Already we have said that Sidney identifies poets and artists to be something like they are the monarchs. Okay, and this is what he says, quote unquote: in the most excellent work is the most excellent workman. So poetry is the most excellent work, and that is done by the most excellent workman, that is the poet.